All right, so want to learn more about your rights as a taxpayer? Get ready, because we're going deep on IRS Publication 1. And you know what? This is actually way more interesting than it sounds. We're talking about the rights you have, the processes the IRS follows, and how you can make sure everything's on the up and up.
Yeah, most people see the IRS as this big, scary monster just waiting to pounce. But the funny thing is, the IRS actually has this whole publication that spells out your rights and tells you how to work the system.
Right, like they want you to know how to play the game. But honestly, most people probably don't even know these rights exist, let alone what they are.
That's so true. So, like, imagine this. You're going through a rough patch, maybe lost your job or got hit with some crazy medical bills. You're barely keeping your head above water, and bam, you get slapped with a giant tax bill. You feel totally helpless, right? Like the IRS has you over a barrel.
Okay, I'm already sweating just thinking about it. But seriously, is there anything you can actually do in that situation?
Oh, absolutely. And this is where the Taxpayer Bill of Rights swoops in to save the day. Specifically, right number 10, the right to a fair and just tax system. Basically, it says, hey, everyone's different, and the tax system needs to be flexible enough to take those differences into account.
Hold on, you're telling me the IRS actually has to consider my personal situation? Now, that's not what I was expecting.
Yeah, it's true. They can't just treat everyone the same way, no matter what's going on in their lives. They got to be reasonable and work with you to find a solution that's actually fair.
Whoa, that's a game changer. So the IRS isn't just some heartless machine spitting out tax bills. They actually have to be, like, compassionate and think about the human side of things.
Exactly. And if you're really struggling, the IRS has a whole department dedicated to helping taxpayers in tough situations. It's called the Taxpayer Advocate Service. Think of them as your personal bodyguard inside the IRS, making sure you're treated fairly.
So it's like having your own tax superhero.
Oh.
That's awesome.
It is a pretty amazing resource. If you ever feel overwhelmed or like you're getting nowhere with the IRS, just reach out to them.
Okay, I'm definitely making a note of that. So we've talked about fairness, but what about getting decent service from the IRS? Does the Taxpayer Bill of Rights cover that too?
Oh, yeah, for sure. Right number 2 is all about the right to quality service. This means you deserve to be treated with respect and get prompt, courteous, and professional help from the IRS.
You're telling me the IRS actually has to be nice to me. I'm having a hard time believing that one.
Uh-huh. I know, right? But it's true. They can't leave you hanging on hold forever, talk down to you, or ignore your questions. You've got the right to clear communication and helpful assistance.
Okay, that makes you feel a little better about dealing with them. But what if even after all that, I still disagree with something the IRS is telling me? Can I actually, like, challenge them?
Absolutely, you can. And that's where right number 4 comes into play. The right to challenge the IRS's position and be heard. It means you can object to what they say, provide more documents, and make your arguments in a clear, concise way.
So I'm not just stuck with whatever the IRS decides. I can actually push back.
You got it. You're not helpless, and here's the important part. The IRS has to respond to your arguments, even if they end up disagreeing with you.
Okay, that's a huge relief. It doesn't feel quite so scary knowing I have some options.
And if you still don't feel good about it after going back and forth with the IRS, you can always kick it up a notch and appeal their decision.
Wait, appeal? Like in a courtroom? But that sounds serious.
It can be, but it's important to know you've got choices. Right number 5, the right to appeal an IRS decision in an independent forum. That means you can challenge their call in a more formal setting.
Got it. So I have the right to be informed, the right to decent service, and the right to challenge the IRS. What else is crammed into this Taxpayer Bill of Rights?
Well, let's talk about something that probably gives a lot of people nightmares: audits. Most people hear that word and totally freak out.
Yeah, that's definitely not the kind of mail you want to get. But does the Taxpayer Bill of Rights even deal with audits?
It does. And this is where it gets really juicy. Right number 7, the right to privacy. This actually applies to audits. It basically means the IRS can't just waltz into your life without a good reason.
So they can't just show up at my door demanding to see all my receipts.
Well, not exactly. Anytime the IRS asks questions, examines your stuff, or takes action, they have to do it legally and for a legitimate reason. They have to respect your privacy and your right to due process.
Okay, that makes sense. I was picturing like a tax SWAT team busting down my door.
Yeah.
But really, how does the IRS even choose who to audit in the first place? Is it just random?
It's not random at all. And this is another place where the Taxpayer Bill of Rights comes in. Right number one, the right to be informed. It means the IRS has to be upfront about how they do things.
So they have to explain how they pick who gets audited.
Exactly. And it turns out they use a pretty fancy system to do it. They've got computer programs that go through tax returns looking for mistakes or things that don't add up.
So it's not like they're drawing names out of a hat.
Nope. There's a method to their madness. And you've got the right to know how it works.
All right, so let's say I do get picked for an audit. What happens then? Do I have to go down to the IRS office and meet with some scary agent?
Not always. A lot of audits are actually done by mail. They might send you a letter asking for more documents or telling you why they think you owe more taxes. And usually you can just answer back by mail, too.
There's no in-person interrogation unless I want one.
Well, you do have the right to request a face-to-face interview with an examiner if that's what you prefer.
Okay, so at least I have options.
Yeah.
But what if I completely disagree with whatever the examiner says? Do I just have to take it?
Remember right number 5, the right to appeal. That comes in handy here, too. If you don't agree with the changes they're proposing, you can appeal it to the IRS's appeals office.
And if I still don't agree after that?
Well, you could take your case to court. The point is, you've got the right to challenge the IRS and try to find a resolution you think is fair.
Wow, this is starting to feel a lot less scary. I always thought of the IRS as this big bureaucratic monster. But now I'm realizing they actually have systems in place to make sure things are fair.
That's a great way to look at it. The IRS isn't perfect, but they do have rules and guidelines they have to follow. And the Taxpayer Bill of Rights is there to protect you and make sure everything's on the up and up.
Okay, so we've covered a lot of rights. The right to a fair system, the right to quality service, the right to challenge the IRS, the right to privacy. Are there any other big ones we should know about?
There are a few more we should touch on, especially when it comes to collections and refunds. Let's start with collections. So what happens when you actually owe the IRS some money?
All right, that's definitely not as fun as refunds. But let's face it, it's something a lot of taxpayers have to deal with. What does the Taxpayer Bill of Rights have to say about collections?
Well, one of the most important rights in this situation is right number 3, the right to pay no more than the correct amount of tax.
So the IRS can't just come up with a random number and say, I have to pay it.
Exactly. They can only collect what you legally owe, including any interest or penalties. And they have to apply your payments correctly.
Okay, that makes me feel better. I was imagining some shady backroom deal where they just decide how much I owe based on how much they think they can squeeze out of me.
Nope. And if you do owe taxes, you have the right to understand how the collection process works. Publication 594, which focuses on the IRS collection process, it explains everything about your rights and responsibilities.
So there's a whole separate publication just for collections. The IRS really takes this stuff seriously.
They do. And it's important to remember that even if you owe taxes, you still have rights. Like you might qualify for payment plans or a delay in the collection process.
So they're not going to come and take all my stuff if I can't pay right away.
No, it's not like that. They have to follow procedures and work with you to find a solution that's actually doable.
Okay, that's a huge relief.
Mm.
But I've heard stories about the IRS putting liens on property and stuff like that. Is that actually a thing?
It's true that in certain cases, the IRS can use liens, levies, and even seizures. But Publication 594 explains all that and lays out your rights if it happens.
Okay, good to know. But let's move on to something a little more fun, shall we? Refunds. What if I think I paid too much in taxes?
Then you have every right to file for a refund. Good news, right? And get this, the IRS actually has to pay you interest if they take too long to process your refund.
Wait, the IRS pays me interest. That's awesome. How does that work?
Basically, if you don't get your refund within 45 days of filing your return or claim, they're legally required to pay you interest on that amount.
So it's like they're punishing themselves for being slow. I like it.
And remember, even if you didn't file a return but you were due a refund, you still have 3 years from the due date to file and claim it.
Okay, good to know. So we've covered a ton of ground here. Is there anything else in Publication 1 that we haven't talked about yet?
Actually, there's one more right that's super relevant these days. Right number 8, the right to confidentiality.
Confidentiality. What does that even mean when we're talking about taxes?
It basically means the IRS can't go around blabbing about your tax information. They have to keep your stuff private and confidential.
Okay, yeah, that makes sense. I wouldn't want my nosy neighbor knowing all about my finances.
Right, and this is especially important now with all the data breaches and identity theft going around. You want to know the IRS is taking steps to protect your sensitive information.
Absolutely. So we've talked about fairness, quality service, challenging the IRS, privacy, and confidentiality. What's the big takeaway from all of this?
I think the most important thing is that the IRS isn't some all-powerful force that can do whatever it wants. They have to operate within the law and regulations that are designed to protect taxpayers' rights.
So it's really about accountability and transparency.
Exactly. And the Taxpayer Bill of Rights is a huge part of that. It's there to level the playing field and make sure you, the taxpayer, have a voice and are treated fairly.
I'm really glad we did this deep dive. I feel so much more informed and empowered knowing I have these rights.
Me too. And remember, we've only just scratched the surface of what's in Publication 1. There's a whole world of resources and information out there to help you understand your rights and how to handle the tax system.
Well, we'll have to save that for another deep dive. But for now, I think we've given our listeners a great overview of their rights as taxpayers. Stay tuned for part 2, where we'll dig into some of the specific resources and support systems available to taxpayers.
Yeah, and we'll get into some of the trickier parts of these rights and how they work in real-life situations. It's going to be fascinating.
Okay, so we covered a lot with the Taxpayer Bill of Rights. But something I'm wondering about is, we've been talking about individual taxpayers, but what about like small business owners? Do they have any special rights or protections when they're dealing with the IRS?
That's a really good question. And it's something a lot of small business owners don't even know about. There's actually a whole resource within the IRS specifically for them. It's called the Small Business Ombudsman.
The Small Business Ombudsman. That sounds like someone who could really help cut through all the red tape.
Exactly. They're like an advocate for small businesses within the IRS, helping them navigate all those crazy tax rules. They can give advice on regulations, help settle disputes, and even recommend changes to tax policies that affect small businesses.
So they're like a go-between between small businesses and the IRS.
That's a good way to put it. They're there to make sure small businesses have a voice and their concerns are heard. And get this, small businesses can actually participate in the whole rulemaking process. They can even comment on IRS enforcement actions, all by calling a special hotline.
Wait, so small businesses can actually have a say in how tax rules are made and enforced. That's incredible. Do you happen to have that hotline number?
I do. It's 1-888-REG-FAIR.
Okay, I am definitely passing that along to all my entrepreneur friends. This is super valuable info. So we talked about individual taxpayers, small businesses, the Taxpayer Bill of Rights. It seems like the IRS actually has systems in place to make sure everyone's treated fairly. But what happens if something goes really wrong? Like, what if there's some kind of misconduct or abuse of power by an IRS employee?
Well, that's where the Treasury Inspector General for Tax Administration comes in, or TGTA for short. They're an independent watchdog within the Treasury Department that investigates those kinds of issues.
So they're like the Internal Affairs Division of the IRS.
Pretty much. They're there to make sure the IRS is operating ethically and that taxpayers' rights are being protected.
That's reassuring to know. It's good to know there's a system of checks and balances. So if I ever have a serious problem with an IRS employee, I know who to call.
Exactly. And you can report your concerns to TGTA confidentially, so you don't have to worry about anyone retaliating against you.
Okay, good to know. Do you have their contact info, just in case?
Of course, their number is 1-800-366-4484. Or you can find them on their website.
Perfect. I'm adding that to my notes, too. So we've talked about the Taxpayer Bill of Rights, the Small Business Ombudsman, and TGTA. It's amazing how many resources are actually out there for taxpayers.
It really is. And we haven't even covered all of them. There's also the Taxpayer Advocate Service, which we talked about earlier, and a ton of other resources on the IRS website.
It's almost like the IRS wants to help people. Who would have thought?
I know, it's kind of surprising, isn't it? They're not just focused on collecting taxes. They also want to make sure taxpayers understand their rights and have what they need to navigate the system.
I gotta admit, I'm a little skeptical. I mean, their main job is still to collect taxes, right?
Yeah, of course. But they also have a responsibility to serve the taxpayer, and providing clear information, easy-to-use resources, and a fair and impartial process is a big part of that.
Okay, I see your point. But let's go back to the Taxpayer Advocate Service for a second. You mentioned them earlier, but I'm still not entirely clear on what they do.
The Taxpayer Advocate Service, or TAS, is an independent group within the IRS. They're specifically there to help taxpayers who are having serious problems or feel like they've been treated unfairly. Think of them like your personal advocate within the IRS, fighting for your rights.
So like the ultimate problem solver.
Exactly. They can help with things like resolving billing issues, fixing errors on your tax return, and figuring out complicated tax situations.
So what kind of situations would actually qualify for TS assistance? Do they help with every little problem?
They're really for situations where you've tried everything else and you're just not getting anywhere. It could be something like a financial hardship caused by a tax issue, or a case where the IRS hasn't resolved your problem through their normal channels.
Okay, so it's for when you're really stuck and need someone to step in and fight for you.
Exactly. And one of the best things about TAS is that their services are totally free.
Free. That's amazing. So there's really no reason not to reach out to them if you're having a serious problem with the IRS.
That's right. And they have offices all over the country, so you can usually find someone local to help you.
Okay, that's super helpful. I'm starting to feel a lot more confident about dealing with the IRS now. Knowing all these resources and support systems are out there is a huge relief.
I agree. And it's important to remember you're not alone in this. Millions of people file taxes every year, and there are systems in place to help you through it.
So what's the main takeaway here? What do you want our listeners to remember?
I think the most important thing is to be informed and proactive. Know your rights, understand the processes, and don't be afraid to ask for help. The IRS isn't some scary, all-powerful entity. They have to play by the rules, and you have rights that protect you.
Absolutely. And I think it's really important to emphasize that the IRS actually provides a ton of resources to help taxpayers. Their website, irs.gov, is a treasure trove of information.
Oh, it is. You can find everything on there, forms and publications, FAQs, even helpful videos. And if you can't find what you're looking for online, you can always call them directly or visit a local IRS office.
So it's really about empowering yourself with knowledge and knowing where to go for help if you need it.
Exactly. And that's what this deep dive is all about. We want to give you the tools and information you need to handle the tax system successfully and feel good about your rights as a taxpayer.
Well, I think we've covered just about everything in terms of resources and support systems. But something I'm curious about is, we've been talking a lot about the technical side of taxpayer rights, but what about the psychological impact? I mean, dealing with the IRS can be incredibly stressful for a lot of people.
That's a really important point, and it's something we shouldn't ignore. The fear and anxiety around taxes can be overwhelming for a lot of people. It can even lead to people avoiding it altogether, like putting off filing or just ignoring IRS notices.
I can definitely relate to that. Just the thought of a potential audit is enough to make me break out in a cold sweat.
And that's where understanding your rights can be so powerful. When you know what your rights are, you feel more in control. You're not just at the mercy of the IRS. You have choices. You have options. You have a voice.
So it's about shifting the power dynamic.
Exactly. It's about going from a place of fear and uncertainty to a place of knowledge and confidence.
Okay, I get it. So as we wrap up this part of our deep dive, what's the one message you want to leave our listeners with?
I want them to remember that they have rights, they have resources, and they're not alone. The tax system can be complicated and scary, but it's not impossible to figure out. With the right information and support, anyone can do it.
I love that. It's a message of empowerment and hope. Okay, stay tuned for the final part of our deep dive. We'll be exploring some real-world scenarios and talking about how you can use what you know about taxpayer rights in specific situations.
It can be a great discussion.
Okay, so we've spent the last couple parts of this deep dive really digging into taxpayer rights. We've talked about Taxpayer Bill of Rights, all the cool resources the IRS has, and even how to handle those, oh no, I'm being audited moments. But now I'm thinking, how does all this actually work in real life?
Yeah, that's the big question, right? It's one thing to know you have rights, but actually using them, that's a whole other ballgame.
Exactly. So let's get practical here. Let's say I'm a freelancer and the IRS decides I messed up on classifying some of my income. They say I owe a bunch of back taxes plus penalties. What do I do?
First things first, don't panic. Remember the right to be informed. The IRS can't just hit you with a random number and expect you to pay it. They have to explain why they think you owe more taxes.
Okay, that's a good starting point. So I get this notice, I read it carefully, and I still think the IRS is wrong. What's my next step?
Well, that's where your right to challenge comes in. You don't have to just accept what they say. Get all your documentation together, invoices, contracts, expense reports, anything that backs up your side of the story. Then you present your case to the IRS, explaining why you think their assessment is off.
So I'm basically building my own defense, like a tax lawyer, but without the fancy suit.
Exactly. And you'd be surprised how often taxpayers actually win these kinds of disputes. The IRS makes mistakes too, they're not always right.
It's good to hear. But what if I go through that whole process, present my case, and the IRS still insists I owe the money? What can I do then?
Well, that's when you might want to use your right to appeal. You can take your case to the IRS's appeals office. They have an independent officer there who will review everything and make a decision.
So I can get a second opinion, basically.
Exactly. And the appeals process is actually designed to be pretty taxpayer-friendly. It's less formal and more collaborative than going to court.
Okay, so I'm starting to see how these rights can actually make a real difference. But let's switch gears a bit and talk about something we mentioned earlier. Innocent spouse relief. This one's always sounded a little mysterious to me. Can you break it down for us?
Sure. Innocent spouse relief is a super important protection, especially for married couples filing jointly. So let's say you're married and your spouse messes up on your taxes. Maybe they underreported income or took deductions they shouldn't have.
Okay, that sounds like a recipe for disaster.
It can be. But innocent spouse relief can protect you from being held responsible for your spouse's mistakes.
So even though I signed the return, I might not be on the hook for the whole thing.
Exactly. If you meet certain conditions, the IRS might give you full or partial relief from what you owe, including penalties and interest.
Wow, that's huge. That could literally save someone from financial ruin.
Absolutely. It's one of those rights that people often don't think about until they really need it.
Okay, so we've talked about challenging an IRS assessment, appealing a decision, even seeking innocent spouse relief. These are some powerful tools. But let's be real, dealing with the tax system can still feel overwhelming, even when you know your rights.
I hear you. It's a lot to handle, and there's so many moving parts. But that's why the IRS offers all these resources and support systems. They really do want to help taxpayers understand their obligations and navigate the system successfully.
Yeah, we've talked about their website, their publications, their hotlines. Is there anything else they offer that could help someone who's feeling lost?
For sure. One of the most helpful resources, especially for people who are new to filing or have complicated tax situations, is the Volunteer Income Tax Assistance Program, or VAIA for short.
Okay, I've heard of VADA. Remind me what it is again?
VAIA is a program where IRS-certified volunteers offer free tax help. They can help you fill out your return, answer questions, and make sure you're claiming all the credits and deductions you're entitled to.
So it's like having a personal tax assistant, but for free.
Exactly. And they're especially helpful for people with low to moderate incomes, seniors, people with disabilities, and those who don't speak English fluently.
That's fantastic. I bet that takes a huge load off people's minds, especially if they're already stressed about taxes.
It really does. It's a great example of the IRS going beyond just collecting taxes and actually investing in helping taxpayers.
I'm honestly impressed by how much the IRS does to support taxpayers.
Yeah.
It's not at all what I expected.
I know, right? They're not just the tax collecting bad guys people make them out to be.
Well, I think we've given our listeners a lot to think about today. Any final words of wisdom before we wrap up this deep dive into taxpayer rights?
Just remember, knowledge is power. The more you know about your rights, the more comfortable you'll feel dealing with taxes. Don't be afraid to ask questions, get help when you need it, and most importantly, remember that you have rights that protect you.
Absolutely. And remember, the IRS isn't some faceless monster. They have procedures to make sure things are fair, and they offer a ton of resources to help you understand your responsibilities. Don't be afraid to ask questions and never hesitate to reach out for help if you need it. Understanding your rights as a taxpayer can make this whole process a lot less stressful and, dare I say, even a little empowering.
Absolutely.
Thanks for joining us on this journey into the world of taxpayer rights. We'll catch you on our next